My name is Octaviana Bellamy. On the day that was supposed to be mine, my father pressed a check against my cheek like it was a napkin and asked loud enough for everyone to hear if I was worth anything at all. Laughter rippled, eyes turned, and I sat frozen, humiliated by the man who had spent my whole life reminding me I would never be enough. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and polished silver, a stage set for joy. But the air inside had already soured. Music drifted above the tables, waiters glided between clusters of guests, and every detail of the night had been choreographed to perfection, until my father rose from his seat at the head table. His voice carried without effort, honed by years of boardrooms and banquets. What he said next sliced through the room sharper than any violin string. He didn't toast my future, or even my new husband. Instead, he let the weight of his disdain fall squarely on me. With a smile that was closer to a sneer, he produced a crisp check, held it up as if it were a trophy, and slapped it against my cheek like a prop in a cruel performance. Laughter sputtered from one corner, then died quickly as people realized he was serious. His words followed, cold and calculated, stripping me down in front of family, friends, and strangers alike. Across the table, my stepmother leaned back with a polished smirk, her satisfaction unhidden. Conversations faltered, silverware stilled, and eyes darted anywhere but toward me, as if silence might erase the cruelty they had just witnessed. The warmth that should have filled the night drained away, leaving only the brittle sound of forced coughs and shifting chairs. I could feel heat rushing to my skin, a sting spreading across my face where the paper had landed. The easy choice would have been to lash out, to meet humiliation with fury, but I had learned long ago that anger only fed him. So I steadied myself the way my mother once taught me, breathing slow, holding on to the one truth she left me. Air costs nothing, but pride, his, mine. Everyone's in this room, always comes with a price, and in that moment, beneath the glitter of chandeliers, I chose silence, knowing it would speak louder than any words I could give. The kitchen table in our house was nothing more than laminate pretending to be oak, yet my father sat at the head of it as though it were a judge's bench. Each evening felt like a trial, and the verdict rarely changed. His sighs, his muttered forecasts, all boiled down to the same refrain that burned into my memory. Still no son! No matter what I brought to him, paintings from school, medals from track meets, or the quiet triumph of fixing a leaking faucet, he looked past me, unimpressed. To him, every achievement was void because it came from the wrong child. My mother, a nurse with steady hands and an endless reserve of compassion, was the only light in that house. She whispered to me that real worth wasn't about trophies or names on plaques, but about how you carried yourself when no one was watching. Then illness took her breath, and with it, the warmth of our home. The house shrank into silence and shadows. My father remarried quickly, choosing a woman who polished appearances like silverware. Soon, she bore him the son he had always wanted, the golden heir who could do no wrong. From that point on, family dinners revolved around his victories, his milestones. While I faded into the wallpaper, the emptiness carved into me didn't vanish. It hardened into resolve, invisible in my own home. I realized the only way forward was to walk a road my father never imagined his daughter could take, leaving that house behind. I entered the Navy. For the first time, I found a language stripped of favoritism, where sweat and endurance weighed more than last names. Orders were harsh, but they were fair, and for once, my worth wasn't tethered to anyone's disappointment. One night in Afghanistan branded itself into me forever. Our unit was caught in a brutal ambush, gunfire tearing through the dark, flames swallowing the air. My team pushed forward into chaos, dragging bodies out of wreckage while the ground shook beneath us. I remember the grip of a soldier's vest in my hands, his weight collapsing over me as I hauled him toward the dust-blown safety of extraction. Later, under dim light, I read the name stamped into his dog tags. He wasn't just another casualty avoided. He was the son of a major general. The revelation hit like shrapnel, but I kept it buried. No one at home ever heard the story, no headlines carried my name. I carried it in silence, knowing some truths are heavier than applause. That night remained my secret, a secret that would one day detonate in the most unlikely place, a ballroom filled with chandeliers, where my father's voice had always drowned out mine. The ballroom still sparkled, but the joy had long since drained from the room. Music floated in the background, hollow and out of place after what had already been said. My father wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, grinning as if the night belonged to him, and produced a sleek velvet box. With deliberate flair, he handed it across the table to my husband. Inside gleamed a Swiss timepiece, the kind that whispered legacy and power. His voice rose above the hush. "This is what true worth looks like in a family. Not a few years wasted playing soldier." Laughter rippled weakly from one side of the hall. Guests shifted in their chairs, glancing at me and then away. My stepmother's smile stretched thin and sharp, the look of a woman savoring a victory she'd long awaited. I lifted my glass, steadying my hand, breathing deep through the sting in my chest. A murmur stirred at a nearby table. Two men, veterans, judging by the way they carried themselves, whispered about a name they remembered from a classified rescue operation overseas. My father's ears caught it instantly. He slammed his glass down and barked, "Don't believe that nonsense. Just rumors. Blown out of proportion." His dismissal rang too loud, drawing even more eyes toward me. Across the room, members of my husband's family exchanged looks. A woman finally asked bluntly, "If any of that were true, why wouldn't the press have reported it?" The weight of her question pressed into me, but I stayed silent. Some truths don't belong to a crowd. The clinking of utensils against porcelain sounded like gunfire in the uneasy quiet. Every conversation faltered, as if the room itself held its breath. My father stood again, glass in hand, his voice slicing through the thick silence. "Every family needs a son to carry on the line. All I have is a daughter who chose a reckless path that means nothing." My stepmother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, feigning tears, theatrical, calculated. Her performance turned the room further against me. Then, from beside me, my husband rose abruptly. His hand found mine, his voice firm. "I'm proud of her." The words cracked the stillness, only for my father to slam them down with venom. "Don't let her shame you in front of all these people." Whispers swelled. Aunts and uncles from my husband's side leaned closer, their voices carrying speculation, suspicion, the certainty that I was hiding something. Their eyes burned into me, not with curiosity, but with accusation. My gaze drifted to my half-brother, seated near my father. His smirk carried the ease of someone born into approval, his pride swelling as our father praised the son who will inherit. I saw in his expression the same cruelty that had defined my childhood. And then, before the weight of it could crush me, the double doors creaked open. Heavy footsteps struck the carpet with precision. The conversations died instantly, replaced by a palpable shift in the air. Every head turned. At the threshold stood the Major General, father of my groom. His eyes locked on me, and the hall fell silent enough to hear hearts pounding. The ballroom froze as the doors opened and the Major General stepped inside. His presence shifted the air, silencing even the clinking of glass. He didn't glance at the guests or acknowledge the stares that followed him. His eyes found mine and held there. His polished shoes struck the carpet with deliberate weight until they came down squarely on the check my father had flung across the floor. Paper crumpled under his heel. Forgotten. He stopped before me, his shoulders squared, his posture carved out of discipline. In a voice that carried the weight of both command and gratitude, he saluted sharply and said, "Ma'am, this officer saved not only my men, but also my son." The words cracked through the hall. The pianist faltered, his hands slipping against the keys. A beat later, two veterans rose from their chairs, their movements instinctive, returning the salute with solemn precision. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. My father's jaw hung slack, the glass in his hand rattling as though even his fingers betrayed him. My stepmother forced a brittle smile, but her lips twitched under the strain. Then the general turned to the room, his voice steady but edged with memory. He spoke of the ambush, the fire, the chaos, and of how I had led the push that pulled his men free and carried his son out of flames. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and I could feel the tide turning. Eyes that once dismissed me now shone with recognition. The hall remained charged, heavy with a silence that brimmed with judgment. Every gaze, once mocking or indifferent, fixed on me now with questions unspoken. My half-brother, the golden heir, shifted in his seat. The smugness he wore like armor cracked. His brow furrowed, his mouth tight. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Was it possible that I, the sister he'd never taken seriously, had been the one who saved lives, including his own brother in arms? Around the edges of the room, guests who had always flocked to my father began to inch away, their loyalty evaporating in the wake of truth. Their laughter from earlier felt shameful now, their smiles stiff and false. My father, once a towering figure, sat shrinking into his chair, abandoned in the very spotlight he had craved. The general inclined his head once more, his words deliberate. "You measure legacy by sons. I measure it by courage. Tonight, let everyone here know who carries it." His statement cut like a gavel strike. The applause began hesitantly, then grew into thunder. Chairs scraped as old soldiers rose to their feet, some saluting, others stepping forward to clasp my hand. Their grip was firm, their eyes steady, their respect unambiguous. And then came the moment no one expected. My half-brother stood. He straightened his back, looked directly at me, and raised his hand in a crisp salute. No prompting, no hesitation, only truth reflected in his eyes. The room erupted, but I kept my gaze on him. My father, pale and rigid, clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened, his face drained of all the power he once wielded. In that silence between applause, it was clear. His throne had been dismantled, piece by piece, right before everyone's eyes. When the Major General left the hall, silence thickened like smoke after a fire. No one moved. The chandeliers still glowed. The pianist sat frozen at the keys. But every sound in the room had been devoured by what had just been spoken. Then it began. One pair of hands clapping. An older veteran rose from his chair, his palms striking together with steady rhythm. Another joined him. Soon a whole row stood, the applause swelling, rising until it thundered louder than the orchestra had all night. The sound filled every corner, reverberating against the crystal walls. I remained still, spine straight, hands folded. I didn't need to move or speak. The truth had its own voice now, echoing in every clap and cheer. My father tried to seize it back. He lifted his glass high, his lips stretching into a smile that never reached his eyes. A misunderstanding." He wanted the crowd to believe. But when crystal touched his teeth, the room refused to follow. The sound of his toast collapsed into the cold air, unanswered. And then my brother rose, slowly, deliberately, his chair scraping against the marble floor. He looked at my father, then at me. His chest expanded, his arm lifted, and he saluted. Not hidden this time, but crisp and commanding, as if to correct years of silence. The ballroom erupted. People shouted one word again and again, respect. Applause rolled like thunder through the hall, and in its roar, my father's shoulders bent, his head dropped low, stripped of the armor he had worn for a lifetime, left bare beneath the chandeliers that once reflected only his pride. When the last notes of music had dissolved and the guests began to drift toward the coat room, I slipped away. The ballroom doors closed behind me, muffling the chatter until only the hush of the corridor remained. The air out there was cooler, stripped of perfume and false laughter. My footsteps echoed against the polished marble, steady, until I heard another pair trailing mine. I turned, and there he was, my father, but not the man who had strutted beneath chandeliers an hour earlier. His shoulders sagged, his jaw trembled. The bourbon gloss in his eyes had given way to something rawer. Fear, regret, a hunger he didn't yet know how to name. His voice cracked as it reached me, a rasp dragged up from somewhere hollow. "Why didn't you tell me? Why hide everything from me?" I didn't flinch. I let him see me the way he never had before, unwavering, unashamed. My words were quiet but carved deep. "Because you never listened." It landed heavier than any accusation, and he staggered beneath it, his face drained, his gaze fell to the floor. He drew a breath that rattled in his chest, his hands trembling at his sides. For the first time in my life, I saw him small, stripped of his titles, stripped of his arrogance. Then the doors creaked again, and my half-brother stepped out into the hallway. The golden boy, once untouchable in our father's eyes, now stood uncertain. He looked at me, then at the man who had worshipped him for so long. His voice was unsteady, but it carried. "She saved me. Without her, I wouldn't be here." The admission cut through the hall, sharper than any toast my father had ever given. My brother's face reddened, but he didn't take the words back. His truth was mine now, echoed before the one man who had refused to see it. A rustle of silk broke the moment. My stepmother swept in, her perfume arriving before she did, her tone brisk, rehearsed. "Enough. This isn't the time or the place. Let's go back inside before people talk." But before my father could nod, before he could let her gather the fragments of his pride, my brother lifted his hand. His voice grew firmer, surer. "No, it's exactly the time and place." Her painted lips parted in shock. She searched my father's face for rescue, but found him hollow, staring at the floor tiles as if they might rewrite the story for him. For once, she had no stage to command. The silence stretched. My father lowered himself onto a bench against the wall, his movements heavy, his body folding as if under a weight he'd carried too long. His hands dangled between his knees, clasped together without strength. The proud patriarch who had mocked me before an audience now sat hunched, a man undone by truth. He opened his mouth once, twice, but no words came, only a rasp of breath, the faint shake of his head, his empire, the stories he'd built about sons and legacy, the kingdom he had crafted with boasts and denials, crumbled in that hallway. The crown he'd worn so smugly had slipped beyond his reach. I stood watching, my brother beside me, my stepmother seething in the doorway. For years I had dreamed of this moment, though not exactly like this, not with chandeliers dimmed and pride broken on cold marble. Yet here it was. He had nothing left to throw at me, no armor to hide behind, no audience to applaud his fictions. And in that silence, the reckoning was complete. My father, once so loud, so certain, sat speechless, a man staring at the ruins of his own making. A few days later, he came to my door stripped of all the grandeur he once wore like armor, no sharp suit, no booming voice, no trace of the businessman who used to measure every room by how small he could make others feel. What stood there was only a tired father, his eyes dim, his hands clutching a battered wooden box, as though it were all he had left. Inside lay my mother's recipe cards, softened at the edges from years of use, and faded photographs that still carried the warmth of her smile. They were the very pieces of her he had buried away, dismissed, hidden in drawers. Now he set them gently on my counter, as if offering back something he could never truly replace. We gathered at my small kitchen table, just the three of us, my father, my brother, and me. The light overhead cast a soft amber glow, the smell of coffee weaving through the air. There were no chandeliers, no polished speeches, no audience to perform for, only us, stripped down to what was real. His voice trembled as he finally spoke. "I'm sorry." The words wavered, brittle, but they carried more weight than any toast he'd ever given. I met his eyes. "Forgiveness isn't a receipt, it's a practice. I can leave the door unlocked. That's all I can give now." He swallowed hard, and then, almost broken, he whispered the words my mother once left me. Air is free. Pride is expensive. His voice cracked, like a man relearning how to be human. I laid my hand over the cards, hearing her voice stir inside me. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning, one where the truth no longer had to hide, 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 no longer had to hide.